Russian airstrikes have started to pound Syria in a new and uncertain phase of the civil war. Vladimir Putin says he's confronting terrorists. But can Russia succeed where Western countries haven't? And what difference will Moscow's intervention make? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, Russia's entry into the Syrian war adds even more complexity to what's already an intractable four-year conflict. Moscow insists that its airstrikes, which continued on Thursday for a second day, are part of an international effort to fight ISIL. Now, the attacks were swiftly denounced by the United States as merely making things worse. But Moscow's military moves raise a bigger problem for the US. The strikes appear to be targeting rebels who are opposed to President Assad, some supported by the US. The latest airstrikes in Hama and Idlib are areas which have seen recent advances by a coalition of rebel groups and are far away from ISIL strongholds. Well, President Vladimir Putin says Russia's involvement in Syria is part of a measured effort to fight international terrorism.
The
only way to fight international terrorism, and these are international terrorists who are rioting in Syria and neighbouring countries, is to act preventatively, to fight and eliminate militants and terrorists on territories that are already occupied by them, not to wait till they come to our home.
Well, this was the response from the US Defense Secretary.
Russia states an intent to fight ISIL on the one hand and to support Bashar al-Assad and his regime on the other. Fighting ISIL without pursuing a parallel political transition only risks escalating the civil war in Syria, and with it, the very extremism and instability that Moscow claims to be concerned about and aspire to fighting. So this approach, that approach, is tantamount, as I said then, to pouring gasoline on the fire.
Let's bring in our guest. Joining us from New York, we have Richard Murphy, a former US ambassador to Syria. And in Moscow, we have Alexei Pankin, a Russian political analyst and columnist. Now, starting with you, Alexei, in Moscow, Russia says it's bombing ISIL positions. Washington and others say it's actually bombing the groups who are fighting Bashar al-Assad, not ISIL.
Well, sitting here in Moscow, I certainly do not know what's going on the ground, and I suppose that very few people know what's going on the ground, and there's a record of distortions and lying on let's say, as our foreign minister says, on the part of our Western partners. So I suppose it really makes very little point discussing who is actually under attack unless you have some kind of factual evidence of what's going on there.
Well, video has emerged, Alexei. Video has emerged, and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights suggests that certain strikes, Russia's strikes, have been on specific targets which they say have not been ISIL targets, but they've been more targeted towards the opposition groups.
In my experience, nothing has been more misleading than videos coming from human rights groups. So I just say perhaps, but I do not know. I do not know.
And Richard Murphy then, in New York, does it matter whether Russia is actually bombing the opposition groups, the Free Syrian Army, for instance, Nusra Front, for instance? Does it matter if Russia is bombing them instead of just ISIL?
Well, it matters very much. As far as we're concerned, the opposition groups, they may be somewhat divided in their approaches. Some ready to fight Assad as the main target, others fighting ISIL. Generally, they all want to keep ISIL at bay and destroy its capabilities. And to damage those opposition groups is to prolong the conflict, in our opinion.
So in the United States' opinion, clearly this strategy carried out by Russia is more aimed at propping up the regime of Bashar al-Assad rather than taking on ISIL.
Yes, that is our reading, and that has been clearly the Russian policy for the last 3 years, that the Assad regime is the one to depend upon to fight terrorism. And they appear to be accepting the Assad regime's position that anybody who fights Assad is a terrorist. We don't accept that.
And Alexei, you wanted to come in there.
No, I just wanted to say that you are discussing the Russian strategy as if it is already known what kind of strategy is this. And we do not really know what's happening on the ground, so it's about premature to discuss that. And as I say, these videos and other things that appear on the web very often are not
all right. Well, let's talk about
evidence at all.
Let's talk about what we do know. What we do know is that Russia has launched a series of airstrikes in Syria at targets. And we'll leave it at that for now. We also know that Russia has a broader policy towards Syria, don't we? And this is something that we really need to explore, because that might help us understand then exactly what the airstrikes are hoping to achieve. So what is Russia's broader policy, would you say, towards Syria in this nearly 5-year-old civil war?
Well, I suppose it was, well, if we take the current situation, definitely it's a two-pronged strategy. First of all, to support the only ground army, strong ground army, and this is the army of President Assad, which can defeat the terrorists, because you can bomb them from air, you can bomb them for ages, and that's not the way to deal with the rebels or with terrorists or whatever you call them. So you do need to support a strong army, and his army is the strongest one, the only ground force that could really, with some help, that can defeat the terrorists. Point one. Point two, I recall that this was from the very beginning of the crisis, that Russia was saying that it was not supporting Assad personally, it was supporting some kind of political settlement and a peaceful transition to a new kind of government. So there's nothing new that's happening. It's just that the situation with this legitimate regime there, legitimate government, has become quite desperate now, and losing whatever civilized government we may have there to a bunch of bloody terrorists, that would be a defeat in a really very serious war.
Okay, I'm happy to say that we're now joined by Elias Hanna from Beirut, a retired Lebanese army general and a lecturer in politics at the American University in Beirut. Thank you very much for joining our conversation. Can I immediately then ask you about what we've been talking about so far, and that is the targets. What have been the targets, in your reckoning, of the Russian airstrikes to date?
I think there is maybe 3 levels for the Russian presence in Syria. First, there is local, there is international, and there is regional as far as in Syria. You know, I think that these airstrikes, first, like, it's a message that the regime will hold, because if you take the location of these strikes, they are on, you know, on the demilitarized zone. It's on the M5 that really separates the rebels, the resistance from the regime. It's like a message that we are here, we are starting from here, the regime will stay, will survive, and then we will prepare for the next stage, which is going to be like very long period in Syria.
And coming to you, Richard, in New York, then, this is a clear message then coming from the Kremlin that it is prepared to confront, if necessary, the United States on this particular issue. What is likely to be President Obama's response, or what would you recommend he did in response?
Well, I think it's clear that President Obama opposes efforts that will weaken the opposition to President Assad. he has somewhat modified the American position that President Assad will have a role in discussions for a transitional government, but that he cannot be the long-term leader. Obama's concern today, at this moment, is that there not be a clash between the Russian and American air forces operating over Syria. The Russians moved abruptly. They gave 1 hour's notification yesterday of their attacks, and there's a need, which the Russians recognize now, to sit down and talk about deconfliction so that our forces and the Russian forces do not come into conflict with each other. That would be a very destabilizing situation in an already unstable picture.
And Elias in Beirut, what is the objective of the airstrikes? We know that the United States-led coalition is using airstrikes to degrade and destroy ISIL positions. What's the objective then of the Russian airstrikes?
I think it's the same, because as we know from history, recent history, old history, that the air power cannot really terminate war or make some victory. World War II, Yugoslavia, even in 1991, the first Gulf War. I think that it's like a positioning now from the Russian side. 62 countries led by the United States of America, with the mightiest, the most advanced air force in the world. The United States of America cannot really terminate the war. They need boots on the ground. Boots on the ground. The American, they don't have it. The Russian, they don't. Even when President Putin mentions the Kurds or the Syrian army, the Syrian army have no this huge human power, and we refer back to what President Assad said in his last speech about the human deficiency. Moreover, the Kurds, they are boots on the ground, yes, but they are for defensive purposes, especially for their areas, like as happened in Kobani. So now the game is very big. Now what we are seeing, I think that it's like how to settle this modus operandi, modus vivendi between the United States of America, Russia, as well as we are going to wait and see how President Obama will reply and respond. Is it like as a conflict or cooperation? We'll have to wait and see what's going to be the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia response, the Turkish response, as well as the Israelis. So why Prime Minister Netanyahu visited Russia like 1 week ago. So it's like reshuffling the cards in the region, and now we are in the situation of modus operandi, rules of the games, and modus vivendi.
Alexei, then, in Moscow, from where you're sitting, what is the objective? We've outlined what the limitations are to airstrikes. Elias has reminded us that there isn't really an effective ground force. So what is the specific objective, would you say, of the Russian airstrikes?
Well, I would say I can only repeat that, in my view, the real goal is to support the only ground force which is capable of let's say, stopping and turning back ISIS.
But the Syrian army, President Assad himself went on national television and admitted to the fact that his army is exhausted and depleted to a large extent. So the fact that the Syrian army is not at its optimal level, it probably speaks against your point. They're probably not able to mount.
But there's nothing else. There's nothing else. There's nothing else. What else? Who else? The Hezbollah, for instance, I suppose it looks like more like a militia, which is a defensive force rather than a force capable of offensive operations. The Kurds are more or less about the same. They're protecting their territories. Iran probably, yes, the Iranian army could do some operations, but that leaves us with only two forces which are really more or less capable of conducting ground offensive operations. And I suppose that Syrian army still has something like 200,000 rather well-trained soldiers, given some support from air in coordination with them, that makes them a stronger force than they were before. So I suppose that's the way things are viewed from Moscow.
And Richard, I just want to put to you a point made by a prominent Syrian rebel commander, Bashar al-Zubi. He's now urging Arab states to give him anti-aircraft missiles, and he has warned that Russian intervention means that the war will go on longer and that it's effectively killed political initiatives. Would you agree with that statement? And if so, and if not, can you tell us what you think the impact of the Russian intervention will be on this war?
Well, it has shaken up the entire picture within Syria, already highly confused, very hard to analyze. At the end of the day, the conflicting parties on the ground, the opposition elements, many different factions, must move towards the negotiating table, and they will find the regime there. The regime is a player. This attack has raised the danger of a Russian-American military confrontation, which neither of us wants. It has apparently not been targeted on ISIL, which Russia says is its main target, as it is the main target of the United States. So it is trying to bolster President Assad with the idea that that's going to help get everybody to the table. I guess that's the most optimistic reading I have of the Russian position and their actions to date.
Elias, in Beirut, how much credence would you give to the suggestion that Russian intervention is aimed at helping President Assad create a kind of a mini-state, an Alawite stronghold to the west of the country? How much credence do you give to that theory that's doing the rounds at the moment?
I think that the Russians, I mean, there is some de facto on the ground, and it's not de jure, it's de facto. On the ground, it's like a statelet. And if you look at the Russians, how they are operating in their near abroad, you see Abkhazia and Georgia, you see Ossetia also, you see in Moldova, and you see in Crimea. So for their mind, it's like really repositioning themselves. Now the opportunity came where you can really influence the Western side, the Americans in particular, as well as the European. So it's like positioning in this area, protecting. And now President Assad or the regime itself becoming like, I mean, a tool for grander geostrategic codes or imperatives for Russia. It is about not only Russia. That's why earlier I said it's not really this level. It's about regional. It is about international. It's about telling the Americans, come and talk to us, because internally the Russians are really having a dear problems, economic, even with the jihadists, even with, you know, the social issue. Now I think that it's a mean for the different ends. So imagine now that Russia having this access, the so-called axis of resistance, Syria, Hezbollah, Iran, and as well as Russia at the same time. On the other hand, we have different axes, 62 countries led by the United States of America. It's about redrawing the map, the geopolitical map in the region. So in this particular situation, I mean, this coastal area where you have Alawite is not so important in the bigger game, in the bigger calculation for the Russians.
All right, well, this is a good moment then for us to hear more about the differences between the presidents, Obama on the one hand and Putin on the other, because they were laid bare at the UN General Assembly. The US president insists that ISIL will only be defeated if President Bashar al-Assad steps down from power, and that's completely the opposite point of view to Russia.
Считаем огромной ошибкой отказ от сотрудничества с сирийскими властями.
We think it is an enormous mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian government and its armed forces, who are valiantly fighting terrorism face to face. We should finally acknowledge that no one but President Assad's armed forces and Kurdish militia are truly fighting the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations in Syria.
And Alexei in Moscow, Elias earlier made a reference to the fact that Russia is indeed technically in recession, isn't it? So how can it afford this very costly exercise that it's undertaken in Syria?
Well, I suppose it can afford. I suppose the Russian difficulties are much more exaggerated in the West, and they can afford it if this is being done. And then I suppose, well, I mean, it's very interesting for President Obama, who is very, very far from the region, to dictate the terms to the Syrians who should be and who should not be there. A leader, I don't know if he's aware of how complex the ethnic and religious situation is there. For Russia, this is really very, very near. It's just across 2 seas from Russia, and there are quite a lot of jihadists fighting there from Russia, as from other places. So I suppose that this is a very logical position to really, and in the best self-interest of Russia and of Europe too, which is quite near, to really to start with stopping ISIS. And that's the only way to do it, by ground operation. And once again, as I say, the only combat-capable force remaining there is Iranian and Syrian. So it's all very logical. I won't be looking for any grand designs there.
Okay.
I think it's kind of preemption before the whole thing is transferred, and like cancer before it spreads even further. And we know how successful has been ISIS, both in terms of militarily and ideologically. So I guess this should be, by at all costs, that should be strangled while it's not too late. So I think it's a very logical position, and which particularly logical from the Russian point of view, which is not very far from that region.
Richard in New York, President Putin's decisive course of action merely serves to highlight, doesn't it, the policy muddle coming out of Washington?
Well, anyone trying to understand Syria is bound to be muddled. I don't care whether he's in Moscow or Washington. It's enormously complicated, but let us not overlook that President Assad's energies over the past 3 years in combating his opponents has been to bear down more on those who are not the radicals, not the ISIL forces. He has been hitting at those who we think must be key players in resolving the conflict politically. And he has identified them as terrorists. He has smeared them all as terrorists and devoted more military energies to attacking them than to attacking ISIL or Nusra.
And Elias, we haven't got very long, I'm afraid, but can I give the last word to you? I'm interested in hearing your thoughts as to how you think the civil war in Syria has now changed. Has it been transformed as a result of this military action coming from an outsider?
For sure, because when you have like a certain balance of power, certain equilibrium, certain stalemate between Assad is not really able to recover all of Syria, and maybe the danger of falling, and then not the resistance being able to dethrone Bashar al-Assad. Here comes another player that will change the whole rules of the game, the Russians. But I don't think that the political solution are very near. The war is very long. It's going to take a long time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all my guests, to Richard Murphy in New York, to Elias Hanna in Beirut, and Alexei Pankin in Moscow. Thank you all very much indeed. And of course, as ever, thank you for watching. You can leave your comments on our programme page on the website, aljazeera.com, or you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or there's always the Twitter sphere. You can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team, it's bye for now.